Hey, what's good? This video is for those patriots that fly a flag that is not American. You're also going to love this video if you are a fan of alternate universes and alternate endings. The infographic show is taking us on a ride in the USA if the South won the Civil War. I'm going to keep working on texturing some models in Photoshop and Blender. Before we get into it, remember to go to coconutjustice.com to get you some clothes that I think would look good on you. Let's go. All right, infographics show. What you going to teach us today?
Appomattox, 1865. Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee, battle-worn and exhausted, sit across from each other. Their faces are etched with the weight of a divided nation. The room is tense, every moment heavy with history. Then, with a single fateful pen stroke, they bring 4 years of unimaginable bloodshed to an end. The United States Civil War is over, and jubilant cheers rise from the men in gray. The Confederacy has won. How did this happen, and what comes now for the two nations that were now one? Find out on this episode of the Infographics Show. USA
Let's
Today,
go.
if the South won the Civil War. What if the South won the Civil War?
At first, I thought it was USA Today making this video. And I was like, ooh, I don't know. There's going to be a lot of these folks that are going to watch this video and get upset. You guys are a finicky bunch. Anyway, here we go.
It might just be the most popular alternate history hypothetical in the world. The question has fueled countless books, theories, and debates, and even a darkly satirical film called CSA, Confederate States of America. It depicted a horrific future where the South overran the North, re-legalized slavery nationwide, and created a country entirely based around human bondage. Fast forward 140 years,
Not even the good
there is
kind.
an America where slaves are sold on the Home Shopping Network. Was this disturbing future close to happening? In a word,
What did he just... What? What did he... Hang on. No, shut up. Shut up. Hold on.
slavery nationwide, and created a country entirely based around human bondage. Fast forward 140 years, there is an America where slaves are sold on the Home Shopping Network.
Good
Was this disturbing
sweet
future
Jesus.
close to happening? In a word, no. While Southern war songs might have boasted
Yeah,
about
take
sweeping
it
into
easy.
Washington and hanging old Abe, it was really just a fantasy. The Confederate Army was
They did the same with what's his face. Oh, what's his face? The dork, the nerd. Oh my God, Mike Pence. They they say, "Yo, there is a bunch of hanging ass people out here." That is terrible. And things just still haven't quite changed, have they?
primarily composed
And let's get that straight. For a lot of people, things have gotten much better. Yes, for all you folks that like to think that racism doesn't exist and all this stuff, things have gotten better, but not good enough. We got to do better. We still have to do much better than what we've been doing. We don't see each other as Americans. We don't do that right now. There's a bunch of folks that do. Both sides of the argument. Everyone has to agree all the way with those folks, or everyone has to agree with all the way in those folks. But then, like we got shit to do, man. We got to turn the page on that silliness. And then you get the powers that be telling us that we're lazy and stupid. And that's wow.
draftees, lacked the resources of the federal government, and was focused on its own claimed territory. Despite surprising the North early in the war and even making bold forays into states like Pennsylvania, they were met with fierce resistance and bogged down at critical points. Any victory would have more likely resulted in their borders being recognized, not the stars and bars flying over the White House. But what about if someone else entered the fray? The Confederacy did make some moves to gain foreign allies, but success was limited. The British were no doubt still smarting from their 2 losses to the U.S. and would love revenge, but they abolished slavery in 1834 and likely saw the Confederates as the worse option. France had also abolished slavery and was in the middle of a tumultuous century. It had little interest in involving itself in America's conflicts. Spain, while still maintaining colonies in the Americas, was situated too close to the Confederacy to be of real strategic help, which means the South's best bet was elections in the North. Abraham Lincoln loomed high in the public eye during the war, but he still had to win re-election in the middle of it. His opponent was his former general, George McClellan, who had been fired by Lincoln and definitely held a grudge. While George McClellan was undoubtedly pro-Union, he was also deeply skeptical about the war's mounting.
Are they doing this on purpose? Are they using today terms to make it make sense, to make it, to make the correlation happen between the silliness the silliness that was happened back then, and then like equating it to literally the same thing. We're fighting the same fights. You guys, for real? Hundreds of years and we're doing and having the same stupid argument?
If he wins and the North faces setbacks, he might persuade the public it's better to let the South go than to keep shedding blood over slavery. And all of American history is different. So now what? Far more issues would have had to be settled immediately. Starting a new country isn't easy, and it's especially hard when it's dividing an existing country in two. Among the first issues that would have to be settled is the border. There were countless families divided on both sides of the line. Imagine if Grandma lives in Virginia and the rest...
You know what I'm saying? Is it just me? Is it just me, or like all of this is still just the same old... Oh boy. We should be arguing about different things by now. We should... This one.
Family lives in Maryland. Over the river and through the woods is now a passport situation. And that's just the start of the new country's border troubles. The Confederacy had recently gained much of its territory before the war via the annexation of Texas from Mexico.
I did not see a hand right there.
This was a highly thorny issue that the Mexicans were still
got away
smarting
with
over.
One right there.
So the Confederate States would now potentially be facing hostile borders on both sides and would no doubt be hoping to quickly establish diplomatic relations. Similar to when the U.S. gained independence, the war ending doesn't mean another isn't around the corner. The U.S. might be sorely tempted to back Mexico in an attempt to weaken the new potential enemy on their doorstep. But the Confederacy has one big ace up its sleeve. Why was the South so determined to keep slavery? It wasn't solely racism. It was far more useful to them than it would be in the North, thanks to their huge agricultural sector. Unlike the North, which could abolish slavery with minimal impact, the South relied on an enslaved labor to sustain its vast plantation system, with control over...
Can you see the similarities? Do you see why a lot of the South is struggling? Do you see why it's left-leaning cities that influence the entire state, that carry the entire state, not just politically, but financially? It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous to be selling the promise that is America and free trade and all this stuff. But there's a whole bunch of you guys that are struggling because slavery is illegal. And and the closest thing to slavery is slave wages, which you put immigrants through. And they don't get health care. They don't get, if you show up, you work, you make money. If you don't, you don't. And then if you don't, then your family struggles, your kids don't eat, and the fabric of the family tears and your family falls apart. This is why all of this is important. You can't continue to do the same old shit and get away with it. You can't continue to make people struggle and not feel like they're like enough is enough. And then the people that are struggling, number one, they fall for the silliness that the people that have money shovel their way. But not just that, but like you're not being taught how to think your way through problems. You're being taught to ask someone else for stuff. So I understand where the Republicans want to go, and I understand where the Democrats are. But you can't do both at the same time. And this country is not in a Republican. It can't be operated as the capital R Republicans want it to, because we still have a lot of people that need to be up to par. They're not investing in education and letting you qualify for all these high-paying jobs. No, they want you to fight for these jobs. They want you to fight for picking apples and doing dumb shit. Meanwhile, they're chilling. They're the landowners. My stance is, as an American citizen, you should have the right to a proper education and even health care. So then that way, you can make proper decisions that will benefit you and your family, therefore benefiting the country. I am an American. I am not one of these greedy, short-sighted knuckleheads that think that you should pull yourself up by the bootstraps. Some of us don't have boots. And it's wonderful if you can walk into a bank and qualify for stuff, but there's a lot of us that, we don't qualify for much of anything. This ain't the way to do it, you guys. As a country, we should be educating and feeding and taking care of our sick and making sure that we are healthy and smart enough to move into the future, because we're getting left behind. You can hear all the people on Fox News talking about us being dumb. You can talk about the fabric of the family, or however it is that they say it. They're always criticizing us, but they don't do shit. How are you complaining and you don't do shit but complain? Either help or get out of the way.
Significant portion of the continent's food supply, the South held a strong bargaining chip. With westward expansion underway, the North would likely push for trade agreements and border access, prompting immediate diplomatic talks. And if they succeeded would depend on one big factor: who was leading them. There was only one president of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, and he would serve for a 6-year term in this timeline. Davis was seen as a ruthless but pragmatic man who would likely have never been open to negotiations with his defeated rivals. But he couldn't run for re-election per the Confederate Constitution, which meant that someone new would hold the future in his hands. The victorious General Robert E. Lee would be a favorite, the same way Ulysses S. Grant was, but Lee was reportedly doggedly apolitical and might have declined to serve, which leaves a sharply forked path for the Confederacy.
He didn't want to get into the silliness. That is arguing.
Including
You're
Vice
arguing,
President
you're not
Alexander
getting anything
Stephens,
done.
who initially advocated against secession and served as governor of Georgia after the war. And then there was Judah P. Benjamin, the Confederacy's Secretary of State and Attorney General at different points. Benjamin was seen as a canny negotiator and once proposed freeing slaves who fought for the Confederacy. Either one likely would have brought a more moderate touch to the new government. But it's not clear if either one could have won an election, especially since a far more fiery figure was waiting in the wings. At 36 years old, John C. Breckinridge was the youngest person ever to take the helm as Vice President of the United States, serving from 1857 to 1861. The fiery Kentuckian was picked by James Buchanan to appease angry Southerners, and he lived up to his reputation as the losing candidate against Abraham Lincoln. He immediately sided with the Confederacy and wound up being the Confederacy's last Secretary of War. As such, in this timeline, he would be seen as partially responsible for their upset victory and would likely be in pole position as a future president of the Confederacy. And that would likely lead to a lot of chaos for the Confederacy and everyone around them. With less than 20% of the people in the Confederacy owning slaves, slavery was largely a privilege of the wealthy elite, a point of pride for Confederate leadership, and they would likely lean into it under a Breckinridge presidency.
Do you get the feeling that corporation owners were the old plantation owners? You guys ever get that feeling? Let me know in the comments.
Them plenty of problems. Europe had abolished slavery decades ago, as had Canada and Mexico, making it more difficult for the new Confederacy to establish diplomatic relations. It would also potentially leave them at the mercy of their northern neighbor. And another issue could bring that crashing down and possibly even start the guns of war. In the decades leading up to the Civil War, one of the nastiest points of contention was fugitive slave patrols heading north to retrieve escaped slaves and drag them back to bondage. While they had the proper paperwork in some cases, many functioned like vigilante kidnapping gangs. And now that there's a border in place between the two nations, that's a much harder issue to resolve.
You guys have seen the newscast where there's people, Americans, that'll go down to Texas and patrol the border by themselves. They have no legal right to be there. They just go to do it. They're apparently defending the country in 4x4s and stuff. The more things change, the more they stay the same.
A slave escaping to the free United States could be a diplomatic incident if the U.S. refused to return them, and a slave patrol being caught trying to kidnap someone in another country would be a much bigger one. So it's likely both countries might start looking elsewhere. Initially, tensions between the U.S. and the Confederacy would likely be too high for much diplomacy beyond trade. Instead, the U.S. would probably strengthen its ties with Canada and Britain. With Canada gaining more autonomy in 1867, the time is actually perfect for closer relations and maybe even a partnership. The Confederacy, meanwhile, might find Florida its most appealing real estate. It's close to the Caribbean, where many islands are still under the thumb of other colonies, and it might allow for the expansion of slavery. But the odds are it wouldn't be long before the two countries clashed once again. The Civil War happened at the height of westward expansion, and there was plenty of territory still to claim and make into states. It would likely turn into a higher stakes version of the many territorial clashes in the lead up to the Civil War. Neither country would have much hunger for another armed conflict at this point, so it's likely only minor skirmishes would happen. Eventually, a latitude line would determine where territories lay, so it's likely the states would definitely...
Like minor skirmishes, like knuckleheads going into schools and shooting up the schools. You know what I'm saying? Like, this is not outside the realm of possibilities. And it's crazy how the Confederate Army, they lost. And people still fly that flag. It reminds me of that Cat Williams thing.
You having an unnatural allegiance to losers is not like you.
Form as they did in our timeline. But what about the people kept in bondage? Is there any hope for them? As slavery was swiftly being abolished worldwide, the Confederacy stood apart. Unlike other nations across the globe, the Confederacy's economy relied on agriculture, where enslaved labor cut costs significantly. Furthermore, slavery had become a point of pride, rooted in the very war fought to protect it. So odds are hardline presidents would bow to the plantation lobby and work to preserve it despite outside pressure. But there's gonna be a lot of that. The abolitionist movement was sweeping the world and viewed slavery with disgust. But it wasn't enough to get them to cut off relations with countries that still had it. But to start new relations with a country essentially built around it, that's a trickier question. The Confederacy...
And isn't it funny how folks talk about slavery and stuff like that, but the folks that talk negatively about the people doing the work, all they're doing is like sitting on horses and they're not doing shit. The reason why they're upset is because they want someone else to do their work. Is that not weird? How about you pull yourself up by the bootstraps and roll your sleeves up, all those good things, and you do all that work your damn self.
Likely face swift diplomatic isolation. This would be especially true if the U.S., a key trading partner for many nations, pressured its allies to avoid working with those dirty Rebs on the southern border. So it's likely that, like it or not, change is coming to the Confederacy. While diplomatic pressure would hurt the Confederacy, odds are that another factor would work against slavery even more: industrialization. As plows were replaced with tractors and cotton pickers with threshers, the plantations would need fewer laborers and more machines operated by trained workers. Mass slavery would soon become unprofitable, but it's unlikely that the institution would be outlawed anytime soon. Wealthy landowners with house slaves would fight tooth and nail to keep them, insisting that Old Man Herbert's just part of the family and they couldn't possibly do without him. Meanwhile, Old Man Herbert shoots daggers with his eyes behind them. But keeping slavery would set them up for trouble, and their future might look a lot like another country's. The vast majority of the black people in the United States lived in the South, even if none of them could vote. And while no new ones would be coming in except in the unlikely event of the Confederacy reinstating the slave trade, more would be born, giving them a larger percentage of the population. While the black population of the United States likely attained something close to equality ahead of schedule, the much larger population in the Confederacy would be staring across the border with jealousy and anger. And when a population has nothing to gain from obedience, they have nothing to lose from rebellion. By the 20th century, the odds are large-scale slave rebellions would become more and more common, with the Confederacy fighting to keep them down. The United States can put the screws to its unwelcome neighbor, including offering refuge to escaped blacks from the Confederacy or aiding efforts to sanction them. And slowly, a Confederacy with slavery might look a little like apartheid-era South Africa, isolated and desperately trying to hold on to a dying system. And if it was to give in to that pressure, the future would look very different. The Confederacy would have a large black population that would likely all vote unanimously for equal rights candidates as soon as they were able to. And it probably wouldn't be long before they rallied behind one of their own. Many former slave owners would likely not be willing to live in this reformed country, so by the time the demographics shifted enough, it might actually wind up being a black-led country. Of course, people don't always take the hint. There's a good chance that the Confederacy might decide not to give up power. This would potentially trigger another war between the former states, reminiscent of the War of 1812's Bloody Round 2, as it likely wouldn't stand much of a chance against the full force of world opinion and support. This would likely end with a much harsher version of Reconstruction. But one thing is for sure, the US would not be the superpower it is in this timeline. With a hostile country on its border, the US would definitely not be looking to get involved in foreign affairs as heavily. It's unlikely it would have been lured into the primarily European territorial conflict of World War I. World War II would be thornier, with the Confederacy potentially seeking out help from a country with suspiciously similar views about minorities. But the only thing that's certain is the United States today would look nothing like what it does today. And it's possible that the end of the war would have just been Act 1.
All right. So, to me, it doesn't seem like we've learned a lot from history. And if you don't learn from history, you're doomed to repeat it. It shouldn't be that difficult to pay someone what they're worth. It shouldn't be that difficult to educate your population. So this H-1B visa thing wouldn't even be an issue. If anything, we would be outsourcing our smartness, our intelligence, our smart people. We would be outsourcing that. We would have to have like H-1B visas over there. They would be letting us in because we would be the ones that were smart enough to take the jobs. And yet here we stand. Your leaders, the people that you guys voted for, are out here telling us that we're too lazy and that we're too stupid. If that's the case, there's only one thing to do, and that's to change the culture. And that's to educate people and teach them how to work their way out of whatever hand they were dealt. We're supposed to, as a nation, that's why we have that social contract. That's why we have the understanding that as a nation, we're supposed to be holding each other up. That's why we talk about blue states holding up red states. Because as we saw here, there's a lot of folks that they need immigrants for as much as you want to be upset and you want to kick them out. If you're here illegally, I'm here for that. I'm here for process. I'm here for the rules. I'm here for, we have a standard set of rules that you need to participate in or that you need to follow in order to be able to be in this cool ass club that we have here. But once you're here, you have to be thinking about the nation as a whole, not just you, not just your pockets. You need to be looking at our deficiencies as a nation. And for me, that's the education. That's the first part. That's the first part. And then if you want to go the next step, all of us that supposedly don't qualify for jobs in Silicon Valley, just to clarify that, we don't qualify for jobs in Silicon Valley because they can find 3 to 4 contractors that don't live in the United States to do the job of one of us. It's not our fault that they continue to raise prices. It's not our fault. All I did my whole entire life was read computer books and educate myself, do algebra, learn how to write software, and learn how to program computers and stuff like that. And all of a sudden, now I don't qualify for jobs? Like, that's not how you're supposed to be running the country. It's not a corporation. It's not any of that. It's supposed to be a system that builds up its citizens. It's not that difficult. It's not that difficult. They have a lot of you guys convinced that all this stuff is broken and stuff. And I'm not saying that it's not. I'm not saying that it doesn't need some cleaning up. There's a lot of money going everywhere else except the education system. It's going everywhere else except busted ass roads and crumbling infrastructure. I'm not saying whatever the Democrats were doing, I'm not saying that was the answer, but whatever the hell this is, we're not, both sides are not investing in education. Both sides. They're getting rich. They're outperforming Warren Buffett in the stock market, but they're not improving its citizens. This should not be this difficult. If we have some immigrant that's the richest man in the world and he got all the money off of our tax dollars, I think my guy needs to kick back in because he's the one who identified that we're stupid and lazy. It was a little bit weird to see how things just don't change, even though you have an alternate ending. People still think the same way. It's still the same stupid stuff. We got to clean that up. I hope you liked this video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up. Share it with each and every one of your friends. And if you want to come hang out with me and watch videos while I work on creative projects, hit that subscribe button and then change that bell to all. So every time I come out with something new, you'll be alerted. Don't forget to go to coconutjustice.com to get you some dope gear. And with that, I'm out.
Coconut Justice.